Christopher Hitchens, journalist and author of Why Orwell Matters, for his comments here today. I'm Connie Shapiro, president of the Commonwealth Club, and I will conduct the question and answer section of this program. We have many questions, so if you would step back up here, I will begin. What would Orwell write about today?
Well, I would have thrown that one out because can I winnow the rest of them? No, I'm just kidding. Well, I think I began by saying what I thought he would already have known and would have hoped to make plain to others about the survival into our time of the party state, of the idea of the leader-worshipping, centrally organized, regimented society, economy, and political system, and how the existence of such regimes is not just a tragedy for those who live under them, but a menace to those who live alongside them or have to temporarily coexist with them. I think that that he would have noticed that, and I think he would have noticed in his struggle for truth and language that I was just mentioning, probably the best known lesson that he taught, and the one that people have assimilated the best, is the attack on euphemism. Pretty names for ugly things, in other words. Thus, I suppose the contemporary classic would be collateral damage as a word for dead civilians. Most people I know, I'm very pleased to say, when they hear a trick like that attempted to be pulled on them, will reach for their Orwell. Somewhere in themselves they know he put them on alert for a thing like that. Of course, they're often not as alert to it in their own discourse. For example, facile anti-war people now say no war on Iraq or no war with Iraq. Well, that sounds okay, but since the argument is should there be a fight with Saddam Hussein, it's doing no favor to the Iraqi people to say that Iraq is Saddam or Saddam is Iraq. After all, that's the proposition the Iraqi people were asked to validate in a 100% referendum last week. So people who say Iraq when they mean Saddam Hussein are doing his work for him and should be aware of it. So it's one thing to be aware of the lies that power tells in surreptitious propaganda, but one must also be aware of the facile or evasive things that one is inclined to say or let be said oneself.
Do you feel, as Orwell did in his time, that the very concept of objective truth is fading out of the world?
Well, Orwell wrote that when he realized that what he'd set down in Homage to Catalonia was going to be believed by nobody, that he was never going to be able to publish his findings about the attempt by Stalin to destroy the Spanish Republic, and that to the extent he could publish them, even in small magazines, he wouldn't be believed. And that the people who he knew who were witnesses were all either dead or in prison or on the run. And he said it will come to a point where what the leader says is true. And if he says it didn't happen in the past, it didn't happen then either, let alone now. And of course you can see there the germ, the nucleus of 1984 occurring to him. So it's a very suggestive excerpt from his work. All I can say is that we now have the archives from Moscow and from Salamanca, the archives of the General Franco regime, open to us, and it can now be independently confirmed and verified that every single assertion he made in that book is true. It's all been, he said, all I know is what I saw, and when I didn't see it myself, I'm quoting people who I think are honest and reliable, but I can do no better than that. Well, and he thought it wouldn't work. Well, it does work, has worked, he has been vindicated, and there's now a square named for him in Barcelona that was opened by the mayor of Barcelona a couple of years ago, Plaza George Orwell. And he might even have lived to see it. So I think what one must say is that even though there are people, of course, of another school now, sometimes I think rather glibly called the postmodernist, who deny that there's such a thing as objective truth anyway, or verifiability in any case, who have an affectless attitude towards reality. But whose tyranny is not anything like the same. They only wear people down by boredom and semi-literate prose, rather than by boredom, semi-literate prose and machine guns and rubber truncheons and concentration camps. But that it's right to assume that it will always be a struggle, that there will never be a point where everyone understands, as it were, what objectivity and truth is, and that these are given or a priori. No, you get what you fight for with that, as you do with rights.
One of Orwell's last writing was, "The problem with the left is that it tells lies about its past." Given your recent departure from the Nation, is this a sentiment with which you concur?
Well, I certainly don't think that the Nation, as a magazine, tells lies about the past or indeed about the present. I think it has illusions about both, but individuals there do, and the editorial style tends in that direction. But it would be false of me to say that this was if it was a campaign of lies, it would be easy to expose. It's rather, I think, a campaign of comforting half-truth, such as the possibility of being neutral in a war between civil society and theocratic aggression. I don't think there is a neutral position there, and I'm rather glad that there isn't, because I rather relish the confrontation. But there are people who think that there is a mid or neutral position, that one can be morally neutral about it, and there are even some who I think are a little, shall I say, euphemistic about the other side, are willing to grant more for it or more to it than it claims for itself. For example, the idea that Osama bin Laden is an anti-imperialist when he wants to restore the caliphate. I don't grant to someone who wants to restore the caliphate that he's a hater of empire. I'm sorry, I won't do it. Or that he's a revolutionary when he's in fact a hired pimp for the Saudi Arabian oligarchy and the Pakistani secret police, and his organization is partly a crime family, partly a bent multinational corporation, and partly a fascist Camarilla. So anyone who thinks that's radicalism is entitled to their delusion, but not. I want no. By refusing to work anymore for the Nation, I simply announce to myself, more than anyone else, but to others if they're interested, that I want no part of any of that.
Continuing on the subject of the Nation, this person writes, "You quit the Nation because they are anti-war. Don't you want to be the voice of reason there? Will Novosti take you back if you say, 'Pretty please'?"
Well, I hope no one would think I was being evasive if I said I thought I'd answered that question. I might add, though, that of course the Nation never tried to alter anything I said, and were sweet in saying they wished I wouldn't go. I suppose I might add one thing: being anti-war is okay as long as people are pacifist. I mean, if someone says, "I'm a Quaker and I would rather die than hurt Osama bin Laden," I can respect that position. But people who are not pacifists, and in fact are secret sympathizers of the other side, and inventors of excuses for them, shouldn't say that they're anti-war. I'm afraid that, as I said before, Orwell does not just expose the euphemisms and propaganda of power. He exposes the glibness and fatuity of all of us. And it's for everyone to look to their own language. And people who say they're anti-war, if they are Ramsey Clark, for example, let me just do this, okay, we'll have it out of the way. There was a petition the other day, which some of you saw, probably, called "Not in My Name," addressed to the President, all the people who don't want a confrontation with Saddam Hussein. And there were various names on it. Marisa Tomei was one, Ed Asner was another. I actually don't think George Bush is going to war in the name of Marisa Tomei, but she may as well say that. Now, whether they know it or not, this petition is put together by a front organization for the Workers' World Party called the International Action Center, whose chair, Ramsey Clark, is chairman of the International Committee to Defend Slobodan Milosevic. And I'm sorry, that's not pacifism. It's not anti-war. It's a lie to say that, and anyone who believes it is a sap, and that has to be said as often as possible.
Will you be doing a monthly column in any other magazine?
Well, I see we're not going to leave this. They did ask me at one. There came a point when the divine Katrina, the fragrant, gorgeous Katrina, and the furry Novosti, in our conversations, they did say rather huskily, "Is there anybody else?" And I said, "No, there isn't anybody else." And at that time, I meant it too. It's true.
Has the advent of the computer drawn us closer to Big Brother watching us?
Well, you're asking very much the wrong person, because I only know how to use the computer really as a typewriter and a telephone. But my instinct is to say no. I remember during the Tiananmen Square events in early 1989, that once I'd been able to take my eyes off Henry Kissinger justifying the massacre on television, though I have never forgotten him doing so. I don't think anyone else should. I was amazed that on my recently acquired fax machine, I could get direct, people from Tiananmen Square were sending out faxes. I thought, that's amazing. Censorship is now impossible. I mean, I've been in countries, I had before been in countries as a writer, where I couldn't transmit from where I was what I'd found out, unless with great luck. Maybe finding the right telex operator or getting someone who was flying out on a plane to take it. But you could be there and unable to communicate. I thought, in a way, censorship has been abolished now. No government can say it controls information. Well, of course, we've evolved hugely beyond the fax now with email, and though that encourages the state to try and find means of keeping a surveillance of it and some control, I think we have reached a point that Orwell would never have predicted or been able to predict, where it's possible to say that censorship is only really a Platonic concept now. It's a wish in the mind of the state and of the authorities, but almost nobody now depends upon orthodox sources of information. Probably the best thing that's happened in my working lifetime.
In politics and the English language, Orwell goes after those who would use language to cover up rather than reveal. Within universities, are we making progress toward teaching students to think and write clearly?
Well, I can only speak for the classes that I teach myself at the New School in New York, and I know that they come there. This is a graduate class at the Liberal Studies Department. Most of these graduates come for remedial treatment, because they know that they've been betrayed by their education so far. They've neither been taught to think nor to read. And so I don't know what's going on. I don't know what happened to them before they got this far, but I know they're in trouble if they're coming to me. And if they're willing, as it were, to seek help. That's stage one, of course. Admit you have a problem. If it's that bad, it must be very bad. And I also know that it ought to be easier than it is. Out of, say, there would be a probable 15 in a first class. The first meeting that we had, the struggle to find a reference and an allusion, a literary allusion that they'll all get, that everyone will understand, so there'll be a common reference point, is increasingly difficult and dispiritingly so. And actually, George Orwell is one of the few handholds, but that's only because he's been inculcated in school for a long time, basically as part of the instruction in the orthodoxy of the Cold War. And that, of course, is to do him and his work a huge disservice. But at least it means that, yes, along with Huck Finn, The Catcher in the Rye, The Simpsons, and usually Gatsby, everyone's read it. But after that, you can't trust a thing. And this, it seems to me, is a terrible cultural disgrace. And it comes from praising students for working so well and doing so well and being so good, and everyone wins a prize and everyone's great. And the worst thing is to upset anybody. Well, they don't get that for coming to me either.
In November 1989, a group of university students in Czechoslovakia were preparing a stage performance of Animal Farm when the system finally crumbled. How much delusion do leaders in North Korea and Iran live under?
To mention another great resident of this area, excuse me, I've already mentioned Robert Conquest. I could give you the example of Czesław Miłosz, who I suppose we would now have to say was in every sense the laureate of Poland, poetic and literary, who's been living in Berkeley for a long time. And in 1951, he wrote The Captive Mind. He was then still a cultural official in the Stalinized party that ran Poland. 1951 is the year after Orwell died, and 1984 was published. And in The Captive Mind, Miłosz writes that within certain circles within the Polish communist leadership, this book, 1984, was passed from hand to hand in illicit translation by people who trusted one another as, have you read this? And they were all astounded by how it described and captured the texture of life in a closed society. And he adds, Miłosz adds, they were all astounded later to find that the author, the English author of this, had never lived under Stalinism or even visited the Soviet Union. In that case, how does he know how it feels? How does he know how it smells and tastes? Now remember, Miłosz is discussing passing a book from hand to hand, a secret book within the inner party. The book is 1984, which is about the passing of a secret book from hand to hand within the inner party 1 year after it's written, and hasn't been published in most of the West. It's the people in Poland got the point right away. I don't think any one writer in the century has ever paid a greater compliment to another, even if it's unintentional, than that. And so, yes, of course people do know. Of course they do know. We're all mammals. There's nothing racially or genetically different between ourselves and North Koreans, Albanians, Iraqis, and so on. Everyone has a rough sense of when they're being lied to, and when they're being got at, or coerced, or exploited. The bet we take that the right bet would be on their emancipation must be the right one. The bet we take that their leaders deserve better treatment must be the wrong one. Always has been the wrong one. I would add only that actually Orwell had, though he'd never been to Stalin's Russia, he did have an idea of what a totalitarian society could be made up of, because he'd been a victim of a very sadistic colonial English boys' school when he was very small. He'd been a colonial policeman. He'd been subject to a purge and a witch hunt in Spain, and he'd seen how easy it was to control the colonial subjects and the unemployed with only a few determined officials. So in fact, by summarizing everything he had learned in his other struggles, he was able to make a reasonable guess. Again, because of anthropomorphic ability, if you will, of what this kind of thing might be like. And we, I think, are entitled to do our best to do the same.
Do you feel like a lefty these days? It seems like many countries have drifted towards libertarianism.
Well, I wish with the question I want to stand up and say who's drifting towards libertarianism. It would cheer me up. It doesn't seem to me like that. I wish it did. Unless the questioner means, which he may or she may, that there's a generally widespread admission that the dirigiste economy, whether merely stageified and partified or semi-nationalized, has suffering from diminishing returns. I mean, that's, I suppose, generally true, and that may go to the point of whether one feels like a leftist or not. Gotcha.
It's kind of like
Thought they might flush him out.
I've been a fan of the comedian Dennis Miller for a long time.
I don't know if the tape will pick that up. Should I be your ventriloquist? The comrade says that he's been a fan of Dennis Miller for a while. Who profanely he calls a comedian rather than a philosopher and satirist, as he really is. And he's noticed that, having at one point been a sort of farouche 60s enragé, these are my words, but he's now more of a libertarian type. Yeah, I'd noticed the same thing, and I think it would be true. It would be true of me in some ways too. Yes, if that's what you meant, sure. But when I work, as I have been recently, with the Kurdish rebel opposition or the Iraqi underground, I feel much more like a Trotskyist, as I used to, much more than I would if I was carrying a placard around the street saying "Give Saddam Hussein another chance." I don't see how anyone can do that and call themselves a leftist. I'm sorry. Not while I'm around. They can't anyhow.
On a September 11th related question, do you find any significance between Louis Freeh, former FBI director's disdain for the Clinton administration, his resignation right before September 11th, and the frustrated resignation from FBI and subsequent death of FBI agent Joe O'Neill?
Well, I know both the stories quite well, and it would take a while to summarize the O'Neill one for anyone who doesn't know it, but I'll do it in a sentence. I think Mr. O'Neill had become persuaded a long time previously that the Al-Qaeda network was a serious threat and was being consistently underestimated by the administration, and made himself obnoxious inside the Bureau by making this point and saying that there was a cover-up involved, say, in Yemen with the USS Cole, a general underestimation of the threat. He then made the crucial mistake of leaving some secret documents in his briefcase in a hotel in a conference in Florida, which gave his enemies an excuse to fire him for a breach of security. And he said, well, the hell with you anyway. I can get a better job in the public sector and in the private sector, and I'll carry on my campaign from there. And on the 1st of September of 2001 became Director of Security for the World Trade Center, and was last seen entering Tower 2. It's the nearest I've ever got in real life in a study to the Sherlock Holmes Moriarty global mutual combat, where unfortunately only one of them falls into the Reichenbach so far. Though I actually think, for other reasons, we won't be hearing from Mr. bin Laden again. I think he's under the rock. I'm digressing only a little, I hope. Certainly there was nobody who took the struggle against Islamic fascism seriously could have been content with the performance of the Clinton administration, which didn't take it seriously, was culpably neglectful of it, and in its one counterstroke, alleged counterstroke, committed an atrocity by blowing up a civilian facility in Sudan on presidential order on the pretext that it was a nerve gas facility, but without demanding an inspection. Note well. If it was a nerve gas facility, it could hardly have been folded like a tent and moved into the desert, could it? No inspection was required, no warning was given, no reference to the United Nations was made or to Congress. Every liberal in the country forgives Mr. Clinton for that. I don't. Had the paradoxical effect, I call it paradoxical anyway, of making Mr. bin Laden look good. A pretty difficult task in the context. No, well, as with the whole 8 years of Mr. Clinton in foreign policy, those years were eaten by the locust at best, and these were 8 years we couldn't have afforded. So Mr. Free and Mr. O'Neill didn't get near, I think, criticizing how unbelievably squalid and pointless that period in American political life really was. And how unself-critical its supporters, by the way, still are. They still think they're only a Florida recount away from having been proved right. What can you do with such people? I leave the question with you, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters.
You've written a book calling for criminal charges against Henry Kissinger. Recently, however, the U.S. sought to exempt American officials, not just American soldiers, from the International Court of Criminal Justice. How does this affect the effort to bring Kissinger to justice?
Well, in the following way, that's, I think, of great moment, and I say that quite independent of my own campaign. Though, I'll just tell you, in case you want an update, that since the book came out and since the campaign began, Henry Kissinger was visited by the gendarmerie in Paris in the Ritz Hotel and summoned to a court to answer questions about Pinochet and the disappearance of French people in that terrible immolation, and fled town. But the warrant is still extant for when he comes back. He's been sought for questioning by the magistrates in Chile, where I've been to testify against him, Judge Guzman, the main judge in the Pinochet case, and Judge Rodolfo Corral, the main judge in the death squad case in Argentina, is also seeking his testimony. An attempt was made to have a judge issue a bench warrant for his arrest in London quite recently, and will be repeated if he tries to return there. The Brazilian government asked him to cancel an official visit to Brazil a few weeks ago on the grounds that his immunity from prosecution couldn't be guaranteed. Some of the oxygen from around the guy is being sucked out, I'm glad to say. And he's not free to travel anywhere without consulting lawyers each time, and there are some countries he wouldn't dare go to. And there's some I haven't mentioned where it's self-evident he wouldn't try and take a holiday in any case. So this is not good enough, but it's a start. In other words, something like a consistent human rights ethic of international law touching war crimes and crimes against humanity is beginning to apply to him. He's also being sued in federal court in Washington, D.C. by the relatives of people who were murdered on his orders in Chile. Unfortunately, that suit was filed on the 11th of September 2001 and hasn't had all the coverage I would have liked for it, but we are working on it. Now, very importantly, and to answer your question, the lady's question more directly, or the gentleman's question, in a recent long article by Elizabeth Becker in the New York Times and in some other reportage that's come into print in the legal journals, it's been made very clear by senior members of the administration that their reason for wanting to withdraw the American signature from the International Criminal Court is the protection of Henry Kissinger. That they are aware that this could be a grave embarrassment to the Republican Party and to the Bush administration, and as they think, because they want to implicate all of us in his crimes, the United States. Now, think about that for one thing. Think about the insult that that involves for American society, American culture, for everyone here who pays taxes or votes. But it's much worse than that. Think about what they haven't done for Saddam Hussein. What's the obvious thing the US administration should have done by now? It should have asked for his indictment for war crimes and crimes against humanity, asked its ambassador at the United Nations to lodge this complaint with the UN Human Rights Committee, or perhaps made an application to The Hague for a warrant for his arrest. It's the first thing you would think that a government bent on regime change would do. Why haven't they done it? Because they can't do it. Because they've thrown away, to defend Kissinger, they've thrown away a weapon that could have punished Saddam Hussein. Thus, Henry Kissinger helps to protect Saddam Hussein. This is not an irony or a contradiction. It's what you would expect, because those of us who believe in a consistent human rights ethic and a consistent international law ethic would obviously have gotten both by now. If you're not going to get both, you have to be against getting either. So the consequences of this are unbelievably serious. And it seems to me that any one of you who knows who their congressman is, or even their senator, should be making a fantastic stink about it, because the protection of Henry Kissinger is endangering civilization in a very direct sense, even more than his protection was an offense to it before now. This is we are really playing for real with all this. This is not rhetorical talk anymore. All of these things matter very much, and it's a gigantic responsibility, both of these cases, that's fallen upon American society and isn't being properly discharged.
Is the American public's willingness to give up or restrict their civil liberties a short-term dementia?
It's never clear to me whether people know how much they've given up. For example, if a lawyer now wants to arraign somebody and have them held indefinitely, and increase the charge of their conviction, the chance, of their conviction, on, let's say, at best circumstantial evidence, the main resort of prosecutors now is not to anything that Attorney General Ashcroft has recently done. The main resort is to what's called the Effective Death Penalty and Anti-Terrorism Act. It was passed by almost the whole Congress under the initiative of President Clinton a few years ago, which, as you may remember, also enormously increased the number of offences for which the death penalty could be applied and very greatly shortened the appeal process, if not abolished it in many cases. Nobody noticed that going by because it was considered to be a necessary law and order measure for the re-election of President Clinton to a second term. People who will give up their civil liberties for reasons like that, for reasons as short-term and opportunist and cheap as that one, are obviously going to be pretty easy to stampede when planes full of human beings are flown into buildings full of human beings. But let's not be in any doubt as to where this rot set in or for who is responsible for it.
Do you think we are becoming a society of sociopaths?
You know, I sometimes get asked, or I did until recently, because I'd written books against people like Clinton, Mother Teresa, Henry Kissinger, so isn't there anyone you like? And now I can say, well, I've written this book about someone I think is rather good, George Orwell. So maybe I'm not as gloomy a person as you think, or as negative, but I must say all your questions are very depressing. Couldn't we have an upbeat question? No, we're not. We're not. But I think by no means is the United States becoming a society of sociopaths, or is in any danger of doing so. I'm afraid, though, that the traditions of generosity and tolerance and pluralism and non-judgmentalism, all of which are in their way as civilized accomplishments, are sometimes used to negate themselves. Are used to make people think, well, perhaps I'm not right in thinking that some people are bad and some people are good. Some people should be shot and some people should be spared. And who would I be to make that call? I wrote a piece in this weekend's Washington Post saying George Bush made a terrible mistake by saying that Saddam Hussein and Kim Jong-il were evil, because every educated, thoughtful, tender-minded liberal knows how to titter at such moral absolutism. We all know how to snigger. Evil, ha! He's painting it in black and white. We all know how to jeer at that. What he should have said is, attacking Saddam Hussein would be the lesser evil. Then every liberal would have been eating out of his hand. Lesser evilism we can do. We can name evil. We have the concept all right, but we only mention it in order to make accommodations with it. Now you're talking. Much better than cowboy rhetoric, isn't it? Or is it? How sure are you of that? Better be sure. The question is whether you have the fortitude, the self-confidence, and I would say the self-respect to say your own culture is worth fighting for, and that that its enemies must be defeated. Some people really feel that they're being kind of judgmental if they say that.